Hi, everybody. Welcome to How Much Am I Worth, the Summer 2022 edition. For those of you who are new to me or new to the webinars, I'm Rachael Woody, and I'm a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant. I've had 15 plus years in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations, and I am currently serving on the ARCS Advocacy Committee and have just recently, as of this month, finished my term with SAA's Committee on Public Awareness and the ad hoc salary groups. So those three committees specifically are very relevant to our topic today, which is why I mentioned them. And over the last 10 at least years of my time in the field, I've spent quite a bit in calculating our worth and finding the various data points that we can use, no matter what type of job or geographic location, in order to pinpoint what our value is. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you. I do have a few questions that you all sent ahead of time. Thank you for those. So I'll answer those while we're recording this session. But of course, please feel free to, if you're watching the premiere live, pop more questions into the chat box. Or I have my email on one of the later slides that you can send me an email to. A link to this recording will be sent the following day, along with any of the links to the resources that we chatted about during this webinar. So do keep an eye out for that, for any of those links. Also, while this is premiering, Christy or one of my staff will be helping in populating the links as we talk about them. So you should see those appearing in the chat as well if you're watching the premiere. And then just please remember to be respectful of the content. Quite a bit of time and energy and my own intellectual work goes into these types of webinars, and so they are subject to my copyright. Also, there is a full screen and closed captioning option for the webinars. They're ran through the YouTube platform. So there's the typical bottom menu that if you hover over should pop up for you to see the CC for closed caption. And then also, depending on what type of screen you're using, you can then select also how big the actual video screen is for you. And then just a good old disclaimer before we get started that especially for this particular topic where we all have different levels of experience and knowledge, as well as living in different geographic locations or holding different positions, the results will vary. So I will be providing quite a bit of information and resources for you to go use and check out. And I will be providing a few examples to help illustrate how the math works essentially for this particular topic, but you will need to do some homework on your own in order to calculate things that would be accurate for you, your position, your skill sets, and where you live. Just a quick outline for our webinar today. We'll start a little bit with ground settings, so doing a bit of a reality check. We'll then get into the gathering and crunching of data, so what data I use, where you can find it. With that data, we'll go through the math portion of how you can figure out your value. And then, of course, the very critical component of building your case, because while it is one thing for us to know our own value, know our worth, and advocate for it, you then need to convince whoever the decision makers are that they should be paying you that worth. So we'll have a few strategies to share there. And then ending on resources, ones we talked about throughout the webinar, as well as a few additional ones that you may find of interest and support on your journey here. And as an update from the last time we did this webinar, which I think was in January 2021, we have put together a workbook that you can go and download. Totally free e-copy. You can find it via Dropbox. And if you have pre-registered for this webinar, you should have received this link in one of our reminder emails, but whether you use this now as we go through it together, or if you use it later on after the webinar, the workbook is very much designed to follow what we go through in this webinar, pulling the numbers from the resources that we're about to talk about, and basically is a spot for you to write down the information that's applicable for you and serve as sort of a guided worksheets type exercise that can act as an aid and support here. So please feel free to go get that either now or later. And then of course, we'll send out a follow-up link to this one in your email tomorrow. Okay, getting into the reality check portion, chances are that you are not being paid your worth, especially with 2022 levels of inflation, which are extraordinarily high. And even though you may work for a good organization, or even if you have a really cool boss, it is likely that very few of the HR people, let alone your boss, know what you're worth, and even less are willing to pay for it, at least proactively. For libraries, archives, and museums, so that's the LAM acronym there, they have, are, and will continue to struggle financially, mostly out of a lack of foundational knowledge or good practices in terms of having multi-stream income, which is a whole other different webinar topic that we can get into later. But especially with COVID, the global pandemic, as well as other global crises these last few years, the economy in general is going through some tough times here, and that always impacts primarily nonprofit sector, but of course trickling into any sort of sector that has archives and museums. Also, as LAM professionals, we're historically bad about knowing and standing in our value. So we're bad about even knowing how much we should be paid. That is not something that they teach in grad school, at least not when I was there. And even if we do know it, we are not ones who are typically one to like go out and ask for it, right? Again, those aren't really skills that we're taught in grad school. And for us, usually we're in the profession because we love it. There's a deep passion there. And that is a wonderful thing, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that we are money oriented or know how to even advocate for ourselves when it comes to money. And to go very nicely into the next point, that the love we have for our jobs doesn't pay the bills. And while it is incredibly valuable to feel passionate about your work, you should also still be paid a livable wage and a wage that makes sense for your type of experience and expertise. And when we are not paid our worth, when our worth isn't recognized, it takes a psychological toll. Okay, to get into the gather and crunch the data piece, the first one up is the MIT Living Wage Calculator. If you have not already checked out this tool, you should definitely do so and bookmark it. Not only is it helpful and is regularly updated for us to look at and be sure that we're aware of what cost of living is looking like, what a livable wage looks like for our area. And we can also then use that to help advocate for paid internships, help advocate for new positions, that kind of thing. One of the newer items we have on here, the Consumer Price Index, that is a resource to use to help track the inflation levels and the percentage increases for a year like this year. This particular resource is critically important to make sure that you're aware of. As we go through every year, for a more average year, it is still important to check, but may not be as critical to the overall information. So for this year, definitely get to know it and have it just be a part of the tools in your tool bag, so to speak, for what to check annually. We're also going to take a look at firms with federal contracts. So firms such as myself, if we hold a contract with the federal government, that means that a good amount of our business and what we charge for that business is public knowledge. And so we can actually find payment details for various services for those provided to the government. There are then the government pay schedules. And so these are the pay schedules for the people they actually employ in the government, and they can be incredibly handy, not only to help define position descriptions, but then equate levels of pay at those different levels of position description. Then, of course, taking a look at job boards, Bureau of Labor Statistics, salary surveys. So whether it's Indeed.com, if there are some specific museum registrar, what have you, for your area to check out, then great. Otherwise, depending on the field you're in, museums, archives, libraries, there's usually always a salary survey within the last few years, at least informally, not formally, that you can go and check out. And we have some links to the most recent ones for those fields. And then your current pay, position description, and position classification, and those of peers. If you're in a particular organization where those things have been defined, then that information can also be used to help you in determining and collating essentially all of that information. So starting with the MIT Living Wage Calculator, this particular one is for Washington County, Oregon. That is where I am located. And so we pulled this a couple of weeks ago. In the left-hand side of the grid, inside the teal box, you'll see that it lists living wage, poverty wage, and minimum wage. So these are the three tiers that you will find in the majority of the resources in the MIT Living Wage Calculator. They have a few other grids per locality that you can get into the details of, but these are the three boxes that we want to make sure we're familiar with. First of all, minimum wage, that's the law. You should definitely be aware of what minimum wage is. Poverty wage is, depending on the states, can be lower or higher than what the minimum wage is. So that's can be very interesting / critical depending on where you're living. And then the living wage. So living wage isn't dictated by law. It isn't indicative of averages of wages. What it is indicating is what it costs to actually afford to live in a given locality. And so you'll notice for this particular area, while the minimum wage is $12.50 and the poverty wage is $6.19, in order to actually live in this area, to afford it as one adult with 0 children, your wage should be $21.60, which is quite a bit more than the minimum wage. And of course, that has knock-on effects for every position. Even if you're above minimum wage, it still, of course, is going to impact you if living wage increases, but your actual wage is not matching that increase. And we'll get into that some more with the inflation resource. So Consumer Price Index, this is the main place. There are many places you can go, first of all, but the main place to start, at least, is with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this is like the official starting point, essentially, for gathering all of the types of inflation data points. And I just wanted to grab this headline for you here from their website. And it was posted July 18th, 2022. So just a little over a month ago. And the title is Consumer Prices Up 9.1% over the year, ended June 2022. Largest increase in 40 years. And then, of course, getting into the statistics, this is from the same website, but you see I've gone on next to the first teal arrow. This is the Western Information Office. So again, for myself, located in the West region, this is the inflation chart for that region. Go and check out your own regions because they'll be a little bit different, even though inflation is being tracked nationally. Of course, that's going to look differently locally. And so down in the second teal arrow area, you'll see the chart starting June 2019 to June 2022, and how When COVID happened, you'll see that little bit of a dip in the stats there, lasted a few months, and then, of course, nothing but a steep incline on inflation since March 2020. So it has been a steady incline, and it has been really felt, especially this last year. So this is all to say this is going to factor into a lot of the math we're going to look at in this webinar. All right, speaking of inflation, when we last did this webinar, that was in January 2021, so less than 2 years. And you'll see on the left-hand side, calculation for Multnomah County, Oregon, which is where one of our major urban centers are, City of Portland. And the living wage at the time was $15.16. And so at least somewhat within the same bracket, though separated by a few dollars, of the minimum wage at the time, which was $11.25. Since then, checking it now for Multnomah County, Oregon, the minimum wage has gone up. Oregon has always been a very well, maybe not always, but certainly in recent history has been fairly proactive about increasing minimum wage quite regularly. And so the minimum wage now is $14.75. The living wage now is $21.60. And so between the two, you can see minimum wage went up. It's that $3.50, if my quick math is correct. The difference from $15 to $21 is $6 plus with the change, etc. But it is even more so than minimum wage is increasing. So in this regard, even though minimum wage has increased quite a bit compared to other states, it is not even close to the accelerated rate of needing to live up to that living wage increase. So this is just one of the examples of where we're seeing that cost of just astronomical inflation happening and showing up in these living wage charts. Here's another thing for us to take a look at. One of the contracts of firms that you can go and take a look at, because it's a federal contract, is from the History Associates Incorporated Company. They had, and I say had past tense because it ends in September of this year. They had, I think, what was essentially a 5-year contract. And so the prices that they have listed on the right-hand side, those were the prices locked in over the course of the 5-year contract, that whenever the federal government used the contract for History Associates, these were the associated prices depending on the project and who was working on it. Now, what will this mean for what it looks like for the next 5 years? I am very curious to find out, because these prices, of course, were calculated and proposed. If it was a 5-year contract, it would have been done 2016, 2017, depending on how far ahead they had to send the proposal in. So that means History Associates at the time was working with data from 2016, 2017. Not only is that a long period of time for a contract, there's going to be the normal / usual cost increases for cost of doing business. But now we have this president sending almost historical levels of inflation for just this year. So what is the contract going to look like for next year? I don't know, but I would expect at least a 9% increase, and that would be just for History Associates to stay even with the inflation from this year. That's not counting the inflation from 2017 to 2021. That is just counting the 9% of inflation for this year. So if we're taking their rates that they proposed and locked in with the 2017 start of their contract, we're then now adding a 9% increase just to cover inflation. This is not even like increasing for other costs of business, because of course those have gone up at the very least because of inflation. So there are several factors here, inflation just being one of them, as to why History Associates should be increasing their prices. By how much though? I'm not sure. One of the things at play here is that when you're going for government contracts, And as a firm that does this, I am very aware one of the scoring areas is price. And typically it's whoever's the cheapest instead of whoever has the best proposal and the price is equated with that value of work. It's whoever has the best proposal, hopefully the best experience, and who can undercut themselves the most. It is not a healthy system, but it's the system we have. And so I will be very curious to see how History Associates balances the very real cost of doing business and how that has increased with trying to still be competitive and still securing those government contracts. Knowing, of course, once they do submit the contract, assuming it's going to be another 5-year contract, they'll be locking themselves into whatever those rates are for another 5 years. Also, because the History Associates contract should be up in September this month, that when they do have a new contract, keep an eye for it. We've linked to this current contract, but depending on when you're watching this video, etc., this is how you can find it. Like literal Google search GSA, which is General Schedules Assembly, I think, federal arm of the federal government, and then just put in History Associates Incorporated. You'll see it should usually always be like a PDF file. It's like link number 4 on here. So if our link doesn't work for whatever reason, you can always also go and find it yourself fairly easily. All right, switching to government pay schedules, which means it is staff employed by the federal government, not a firm, not a contract. This is actual staff. They use a position classification system. If you're working for any sort of municipality or if you're working for any sort of company that's large, you will typically have some form of this and have it, whether it's position classifications, position descriptions, something in that flavor of lingo. Given that we're talking about libraries, archives, and museums, there's a few different classification schedules that you can go and check out. You'll see I have screenshots of 3 of them that are probably the most applicable for this group. The first one being the 1420 series, that's for archivists. The 0170 series, that one is the history series where you'll typically find more research, history orientation. And then there's a librarian series, which is the 1410 series. So go and play around with, if you're not like a librarian or an archivist, go play around with the schedules to see which one has the best fit for you. But as the government, they have pretty much every sort of classification under the sun. So you should hopefully be able to find something that will work for you. 2 things that are very helpful here. The first one, and what I point out on the right-hand side of the screen, is that the classification gives you like the literal defining of that position. So you have the nature of the job, the nature of the work, and then like for archivists over here, the 1420 series, you'll then notice there's the -05, -07, -09 through to 13. Those are the increasing levels of archivists by years accrued, experience accrued, responsibilities held, etc. So not only do you have that base level description of what is an archivist in this case, but you then also have the add-on descriptions of what level of archivists there are and what that looks like in terms of experience and responsibilities held. The other area where this is supremely helpful is that there's a pay schedule. Everything is very transparent here. It's the federal government, which is why that is, and makes it very nice for us to always have updated annual numbers. This is especially true for our fields where there may not be a salary survey, certainly nothing formal every year, which we'll get into those in just a moment. But you'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen, we have from the OPM branch of the government, we have a pay table and we've got it based per locality. And so depending on what the closest locality is to you, you can take a look at the various rates, whether that is an annual or an hourly rate. And because of how the federal government has set up its classification system, it doesn't matter necessarily that you're an archivist versus an engineer, for example. What matters is the grade. So for archivists, they're the 1420 classification, but we then saw the grades for -05, -07, -09 through to 13. That's what we're looking at here. So if you're an archivist 1420 living in this case in the Chicago area, let's say you're a -09, so you're just out of grad school, a little bit of experience maybe, your annual starting salary for the federal government is $60,840. It is that straightforward. These are great tables to reference, because at the very least, it gives you up-to-date numbers annually. Do keep in mind it is the federal government, and so the rate at which they pay, if for better or worse, could be higher or lower than what the market rate is, and we're going into that area of information very shortly. But at the very least, it's a data point that is dependable, it is updated regularly, and it is very easy for you to go through and find what your pay should be, and at an hourly and an annual rate. Speaking of salary surveys, not a whole lot has come out since the 2019 conference seasons. That's where a lot of these informal salary surveys started to come out. This particular slide was a leftover from the last webinar, and I left it in here because we were seeing, based on the data provided in 2019 and then compared to past surveys, and in this case, a census of like 2006 or something, that adjusting for like cost of inflation, et cetera, the commanding wage rate, our wages were still going down. The actual like bang for the buck was going down. So major devaluation happening for archivists, but of course this is pervasive for libraries and museums as well. So already not looking good, and this is prior to the pandemic. And as of a few days ago, of course, before recording this webinar, a census 2 came out. So I gave and have given the Society of American Archivists a pretty hard time over the last few years of how irregularly this survey is done. In fact, in the actual article, it says it's been 17 years. Not for lack of trying, to be fair to them. They have tried to seek federal funding through like IMLS, but this is really something that needs to be done more frequently. I would say even annually, and is something that should perhaps be budgeted for by this group. But that's just one archivist's opinion. This data has just come out. There's so much in here. I have not had a chance to digest it all, but I did want to point out that you can go and look at it for yourself. Even if you are not an archivist, there are some trends that the authors of the survey have identified that will be parallel and perhaps insightful for your field as well. So it is worth poking around. I did want to point out here that we are seeing still the majority of archivists in this case being stuck in the basically $60,000 or less club. And this is irrespective of how many years of experience. And it is just really disheartening to see. This was this particular number bracket was something that came up in the salary survey of 2019 that I had brought up. This is basically has stayed the same for 20 years at least since I've been in the field. So again, I haven't had a chance to dig into all of the data yet, but I am not pleased to see how stuck we still are, especially when inflation is so high. All right, market research, because not all of us can work in the government or want to work in the government. There are, of course, the tried and true websites that everybody can go and use. For Google, for example, just Googling, I need a library job while looking for the INALJ site. They are now, and Google are now coalescing jobs as part of your Google search results. And I was pleasantly surprised with how appropriate a lot of their results were in this particular area. So I recently discovered that. Maybe it's just a me thing, but if you did not know about this, definitely worth checking out. There's the regular job boards, LinkedIn, Monster, ZipRecruiter, Indeed, etc. Those can be somewhat helpful, at least while they don't have all of the library, archive, or museum jobs. They will have at least a few that you can narrow down to your state or regional level. There then, of course, is both the regional and national job boards for whichever organizations you are a part of, that many of them have their own job boards that you can go and check out. There are then the I Need a Library Job, Archives Gig, Museum Savvy, some of the more privately ran job board lists that are, I believe all of them actually, are still freely available to anybody who needs to go look and find a job. So all of these sites together can be very informative for you to go and check out on demand to see what sort of jobs are out there, first of all, and how much those jobs are commanding. What is a nice trend and something optimistic to share with you all is that because of a lot of the salary advocacy that started happening, well, let's be honest, salary advocacy has been happening forever, but there was quite a good bump of momentum in 2019 going into 2020. And many of the regional organizations have shifted to a salary range being required for job posts. We are finally starting to see some of the national organizations require that too, which means for us that we have even more data to play with when we're looking at these job posts. So that's all to say, go and check out the various different market research, government, job classifications, just even more data for you to crunch. All right, we're now going to get into the figure out your value portion of this. So based on all of the websites that we saw, all of our research, all of the different numbers, facts, and figures that we gathered, we're going to take that all and start to populate it and figure out what is the actual math for how much we're worth here. All right. We're going to go through a couple examples, and so that we have sort of a continuity of math as we go through those examples, I'm going to stick with archives as a field just so you can see how it's translating. However, you could put in any, like this is a museum registrar or this is special collections librarian. The title is not as important here as you seeing and understanding how the math is changing based on level of expertise and responsibility required. So, example one, this example was one that we covered the first time we did this webinar, so January 2021, not even 2 years ago. And it was for a job based in Charlotte, North Carolina, title of it being head of archives and special collections. So that's insinuating that there's going to be at least 5 years of experience required, definitely a master's, at least one of them. And then also, yes, experience masters. Oh, and responsibility. You're going to have, obviously, as head of a department, some amount of responsibility over people, money, or both. So at the time, the 2019 salary survey that was done for Charlotte, North Carolina, the average annual salary was about $66,000. The GSA, the government schedules for a 1420 grade 10 here, step 5, we're looking at 67,000. So trying to match up in terms of type of position as well as longevity in the field. We then took a look at peer information for that area. So 65,000 to 75,000 seemed to be a range there. And then we took a look at the GSA. And then we took a look at the GSA price list, which had it at 93,000. But of course, that's if you are a private consultant versus being public servant or working for a small nonprofit. So quite a bit of a range here for Charlotte, North Carolina. We then went through and updated. So the left-hand side is the numbers from January 2021. The right-hand side is the updates based on just the 9% inflation from this last year. So just doing like that basic math here. We have from the 2019 salary survey, there's not an updated one for us to reference, so I've added a 9% increase to it, which means we're looking at about 72,000 for annual salary, assuming everything has stayed the same except for inflation. Then taking a look at the GSA 1420, grade 10, step 5, so like the exact same position, grade step, etc. You see that the government's increased it by a couple $1,000s. We're now up to 69,000. And looking at the market rate, which was not one that I had specified over here, but it's essentially the peer rate. So we've got the peer rate here, added 9%, which got us to a range of 70,000 to 81,000. And that's just doing the straight math at the 9%. I then went and pulled the new market numbers from right now instead of doing the math on the old market numbers. And it has actually gone down based on the jobs that are available right now in Charlotte, North Carolina for this type of position. The range has gone down to 55,000 to 61,000. So question mark here, what the heck is going on in Charlotte, North Carolina? Some of it has to do with the positions that happen to be available right at this moment are valued much less than the positions that we looked at 18 months ago. Even so, this is a precipitous drop from what we were looking at just 18 months ago. So this is concerning to me, Charlotte, North Carolina. Then doing the math for the GSA price list, just adjusting for that 9% inflation increase, you're now looking at 6 figures for this type of job. That again is if you're a private sector, being able to command a higher price rate. But with all of this in mind, minus this really bizarre showing of jobs currently, the other numbers show that we should be looking at least $75,000 annually for a head of archives in Charlotte, North Carolina. All right, example number 2. For this particular one, we're looking at a project archivist / archivist. So we're looking at entry level versus last example, head of archives. Entry level is somebody who may have that master's, they may have about a year or so of experience, maybe made up from internships, what have you. Looking at the 2019 salary survey, we have in today's dollars about a $52,000 starting annual salary. In looking at the GSA schedule, so 1420 for archivists, the grade 9, because there's a master's and like maybe a little bit of experience here, we have a starting salary of $60,000. In doing that market rate, so looking at pure jobs that are available currently for Chicago, Illinois, we're looking at a range here of $56,000 to $80,000, with that average spot being in the $63,000 category. And then if we're looking at that GSA price list and doing the math for this particular type of position title with the 9% adjustment, we're looking at 52,000. So when we're looking at 52,000 from the salary survey, almost 53,000 from GSA, we're then looking at from the government schedule 60, almost 61,000, and then 63,000 from the market rate. That market rate especially should be pushing up whatever the proposed salary is going to be for this position. So we know from the math, it needs to be at least $52,000, like at least, and that you should be really shooting for trying to get up to the $60,000 mark, especially this year. So for this one, the math actually makes a little bit more sense, especially with the market rate showing here. That's all to say for this particular area, Chicago, Illinois, it's obviously a great cultural center. There's going to be more archives, museum jobs. They will hopefully be valued a little bit better. And so for me, this math checks out, and it's a little bit more straightforward to follow for this one. All right, example 3. So this is going to be for like the mid-level archivist. So we covered like head of archives in Charlotte, North Carolina, like 5+ years experience, lots of responsibility, etc. We then just looked at like entry-level archivist. There's probably a master's, maybe a little bit of experience. We are now looking at the middle. So like an archivist who's got a good 3 to 5 years experience, who does have responsibility, but not like head of a department responsibility. And in checking out those credentials, using the 2019 salary survey, in today's dollars, that rate is looking at $67,000 annually. When we're looking at the federal government, so in this case, it would be a 142009, and then like step 5, because in government, you're not going to the step 11 until you are head of a department. You're at 68,000, or 68 and 500, almost 1,000. And looking at the market rate in this particular area, we're looking at Seattle, Washington. We're looking at a range of 56,000 to 80,000. So again, that average being 63,000, very similar to Chicago, Illinois. And then GSA price list here, we have got, with the 9% inflation adjustment, an annual salary of the 63,000. So between market rate and the GSA price list here, we're seeing a very close $63,000 minimum. But we're also seeing, at least according to the government and at least according to the salary survey adjusted for inflation, that really 67 to 68,000 is more in keeping with the position in terms of being the higher end of that range. So with those in mind, proposed salary being $65,591 for medium, mid-level archivist, 3 to 5 years in the Seattle, Washington area. And because we always get this question, wait, what about consultants? So there is a whole webinar about consultants and consulting that I have already done for the Society of Independent Archivists. You can go check it out. If you have questions about consulting, we will probably be doing an update to this later this year. So for now, I'm just going to cover briefly in 2 slides how this looks for consultants. And the math comes down to this equation: taking whatever it is that your hourly rate would be at a traditional job, adding expenses in terms of cost of doing business, and that's everything from internet to having to pay for your business license annually, to printer paper, to health insurance, everything that it costs for you to run your business, down to the pencils. The administrative time, because of course, as you're running a business, you can't bill the client for all of the hours under the sun. There's general administrative tasks you have to do. There are things that you have to do to run this business that just aren't going to fall under billing the client for. So you have to account for that time as well. And then of course, taxes. Whether you're a sole prop or single member LLC, or you're a growing firm and you have some employees, there is always going to be at least some amount of taxes you have to account for. And as a consultant, those taxes are typically always passed on to the clients to help pay for. So those are all factors that need to be accounted for and included in your hourly rate as a consultant. And so that's why they're included in this equation. A popular tip across all fields, like I guess irrespective of what field you're in, if you're a consultant, the popular tip is taking your hourly rate at a traditional job and multiplying it by 3 and having that be your consultant rate. I have found that that is fairly accurate, as long as you are accurately calculating for what your traditional hourly rate should be. And should be, see previous conversations in terms of expertise, education, that kind of thing. So my tip to help check that math is to then also take a look at JSA for the history associates. So like literally the little price table that we were looking at earlier. Take a look at where you fall in terms of like, are you Archivist 1, Archivist 2, or Historical Researcher 1, Researcher 2, and use those also as a guidepost to see if your times by 3 math is somewhat similar to their price table, adjusting for inflation, and do the math a couple different ways to see if you're getting a close and fairly similar number across all three, because that means you are on the right track. And to share with you my rate as a consultant, so think about Director of Collections / CEO, because I am now running a small firm. I have employees. I also have 15 plus years of experience in this field now and work with national and international clients. So with that level in mind, if I were to take a look at the History Associates price table for their top tier there, they're looking at $199, and I believe that is pre-inflation total. If I were to look at the market rate for someone like myself, education experience, and then do the math, the times 3 hourly, we're looking at least $183.90. And then if I were looking at the GSA schedule, so 1420 Archivist, but at the top of the classification grade there, I am looking at least $201.78. So you can see we've got a pretty good hovering around the $200 mark, with the market rate just being slightly lower than that. My hourly rate is $200, at least currently, pending inflation and other costs of business. And it can seem like quite a lot. I know for many of you who have reached out, who are considering consulting and trying to do the math, it can seem like a lot of money you're asking for when you're not used to asking for it, and when you're not used to paying the cost of doing business. So many people don't think about how much it actually does cost to run a business. You can't just charge for your hourly rate as if you were just a traditional employee, because you are then not accounting for any of the taxes that you are liable for, let alone any of the other business liabilities of where you need to pay money to be operating correctly, etc., let alone making sure that it's affordable for you to still be consulting. If you need to get insurance, you need a retirement plan, etc., all of those things the clients help pay for, and that is why it needs to be in your hourly rate. Another thing to keep in mind, and certainly as my firm has grown to include more employees, is that you need to charge an appropriate amount to pay yourself and your employees an appropriate amount. My firm is one that pays based on market rate, and the numbers that we're looking at very often. My firm is also one that's giving 100% paid health insurance and a 401k retirement plan. And those are things that are needed to run an ethical company, in my opinion. These are things that we need to help take care of and make sure that the employees are treated ethically and that they are being taken care of financially as appropriate. There are some clients out there that you as a consultant may run into that are just shocked that you would ask for that much money, and flavors of shame in the how dare you situation. And those are not good clients for you, because if they can't understand the principles of needing to do business, pay taxes, understand that they need to pay you a living wage, then this is the math that needs to be done. So that's all to say, make sure you have your math down, make sure you're asking for a correct amount, because you're doing nobody any favors by offering a too low rate, especially yourself, because it's really going to screw you at the end of the year. All right, building your case. We've got all the numbers. Let's do this. So gather the data, calculate your value. Do it multiple times, work with a lot of different numbers, do the math with friends, like whatever helps you get really comfortable with those numbers, because you will need to have those numbers at your fingertips and supremely comfortable in those numbers for you to start talking to HR and your boss. Now, once you have all of that, always stand in your value. So when you are having these conversations, regardless of what the feedback is on the other side of the table, so to speak, always stand in your value. Even if you're not being paid that value, know what that value is and communicate it regularly. Also, do decide what you will or will not accept regarding pay based on your value calculation. So while we did the math in several different examples, you saw that there was a range of salary that we were seeing from the various sources. Even so, depending on what type of organization you're in, what state it's in, for a variety of reasons, the salary you're on is perhaps not even within that range. It is lower. And so that is something that you need to decide, because only you can decide what it is you will or will not accept when it is that low. Also, take every opportunity to point out the value that you bring to the organization. While we have things that are in our job descriptions that are daily responsibilities or at least periodic responsibilities, even though it is in your job description, it is still bringing value, and it is worth pointing that out to HR and your bosses. And then, of course, in any areas where you are going above and beyond, where you're bringing even more value than could possibly be captured in your job description, make sure you are documenting those and communicating those to HR and your boss as regularly as feasible. And then track your victories, track metrics, track other measurables to show how good you are at your job, because all of that is great evidence to pair with the numbers to show to HR and your boss and make your case. Don't stop asking for better, more accurate compensation until they pay you your worth. While they may not have money, you know that they may not have money, or at least they say they don't have money. It doesn't mean you don't ask for it, because they need to be made aware. They need to plan accordingly for so many reasons. Even if you know they don't have the money, you still need to ask for it. Also, because unfortunately so many of LAM organizations are somewhat psychologically toxic, do not let your higher ups gaslight you or offer irrelevant excuses. Heck, even relevant excuses. They still need to pay you your worth, and it is their job to figure out how to do that. Also, don't let them tell you that they didn't budget to cover inflation/cost of living without also providing a plan for how to deal with it. Many of the companies and businesses this last year did not budget for a 9% inflation increase. This year is super weird. However, many of our organizations aren't really budgeting for cost of living increase or inflation ever. When I was working in one of my previous traditional employment jobs, this was an area that they just were not great at. And so whether your place of employment budgeted for a 2% cost of living increase or didn't budget for anything at all, regardless, it's not 9%, and they need to figure out how to get you to 9%. Otherwise, you are making less money because your money is not going as far. That is inflation. And you can't turn around to your landlord or mortgage or phone bill or what have you and say that you didn't budget for the cost increase. That doesn't fly. And so taking that principle and reality and transposing it to your place of employment, while it may seem hyperbolic to them, it is actually quite literally you have less money and they need to figure that out. That is a them problem. And it is not okay that they just didn't figure out how to budget for it. All right, don't self-censor, anticipate the no, or engage in any other thought patterns that doesn't put you first. Because we are so empathic, because we care about the work that we do, because we typically realize that there's not enough money to go around, I have seen way too many people not even ask or advocate for themselves because all of those things are present for them. And what is unfortunate is that all of those things are present and they usually will never go away. And so there will never be a good time for you to advocate for your value in terms of like when it would be convenient for your boss. So strip that away, put you first. Again, it is their job to figure it out. Also, don't accept HR/your boss telling you what you're worth. Their information and motives are suspect. Unfortunately, I have experienced and seen this way too many times. And the truth is, first of all, they're not doing their own research. And if you're at an organization that's not like a museum or archives, many times your boss has no idea what it is you actually do and how that value translates. Same for HR, unfortunately. Also, their motives are suspect. They don't want to pay you what you're asking for because then they might have to pay everybody what they're asking for. But again, that is not your problem, that is their problem. Don't let inaccurate position descriptions slide. If you are regularly being depended on to do more and that is not actually in your job description needs to change and be reassessed for more compensation. And do not let them change your job title to reflect you doing more responsibility without compensating you more. Do not take a changed job description and or a changed job title without the compensation being increased. Otherwise, you are just screwing yourself. And then don't let them pigeonhole you into a big category that isn't accurate. I got to experience this one firsthand where they just didn't like really know what an archivist was in HR, nor did they know what sort of category it should go in. So they picked the category that was more convenient for them, aka the cheapest one for them. So don't let them do that to you. Knowing your value, priceless. Mostly because nobody else is going to do the work to figure it out. So please do this math so that you know your value, because it can help inform so many other things, both in your professional and personal life. One last thing, it is going to take time. While doing the math can be easy, you can do it in an afternoon, while making your case is doable, you can put it together. It is still going to take time, whether it's time for you to sort of build up to it, to advocate for yourself, and it's going to take time with your organization because they move as slow as molasses. Also, make sure your requests are formally documented. So whether in email, notes to yourself, etc., document what sort of information you're providing and when, and especially if you're submitting formal requests for like position description update, compensation increase, etc., have dates and names of when those are taking place. Also, you likely won't get everything you ask for the first time you ask for it. And as that conversation continues, if there's not like they can't change your salary right away until July or whatever, can they give you more time off? Is there ability to be more flexible in remote working? Or what are some of the other, and in my next bullet point, other non-monetary benefits that could help supplement in the short term while they figure out how to compensate you appropriately? Also, if they are not compensating you appropriately and they continue to not compensate you appropriately, it is time to scale down your work to what they are paying you for. You are not doing yourself or them any favors by doing work differently from what they've set out with that position description. Another task to think about is, depending on where you're at with your organization, their ability to pay, their ability to proactively operate ethically with their employees and paying them their worth, it may be time to look for another job. And of course, continue building your network and investing in yourself. Those are things that you can take with you anywhere you go. They're portable. It's building yourself as someone in the industry, and that is always something that contributes to your value and future job prospects. So whether you're looking to move on or not, these are always some great activities for you to do in the meantime. Resources. So the How Much Am I Worth workbook that follows along with this particular webinar to help you do the math. There's the MIT Living Wage Calculator that we took a look at when we started with the data section. The Consumer Price Index, that is where you're going to find all of the the inflation numbers you could possibly need. History Associates, at least for their Right Now contract, that's the link for it. Government pay schedules you can find at the OPM government branch, and that's the link where you can find any of the 1400s for the 1420 Archivist, and then you can also check out OPM for some of the other classifications. And then the pay tables, and that was pay by location with the hourly and annual salaries. You can find those at the OPM branch as well. In terms of salary surveys, there, to my knowledge, has been no new informal ones, whether at the museum or the archives world. So there's links to the most recent ones that I am aware of. There's the A census that was done from 2004 to 2006. And then the, as of this week, just dropped details of the A census 2 that was ran over this last year. So go and check out that fresh data. Whether archivist or not, there's some interesting trends in there. Then there is the library work-life salary survey. It's 2012. I have yet to find a more recent one, but if you're using those numbers, librarians, just make sure you're doing the inflation math to at least get an accurate 10 years later number. And then this is another one that's fairly old, and it's from Australia, but it's one of the few historian type salary schedules that I have seen. So take a look at the scale of fees, do the math both in terms of currency translation as well as inflation translation. And webinars. So we have the Basics of the Consulting Business webinar that was done a few years ago that I had mentioned. There's the Ask Me Anything Career Edition that covers some of the questions that have come up with this webinar and leading up to this webinar. And then there's the How Much Am I Worth 2021 edition, which has fairly similar content, but in case you want to check out that older edition, that one is there for you as well. And do check out, this is the, I believe it's Digital Library Forum? No, forgetting the F. Anyway, they have tons of labor resources for us, whether you're a library, archivist, museum type person. There's a lot of great labor advocacy in here. And that is not just if you're looking for a job, but also trying to navigate while you're in the job. Any type of advocacy, this is a great resource, including for labor. So please go check it out. The folks over there at DLF are doing a tremendous job continuing to create resources that are so helpful across the landfills. And then, of course, please feel free to connect with me. We're going to get into questions in a minute, but you can check out website for more services, connect on LinkedIn or Twitter. The YouTube channel has, I think we're almost at a couple dozen webinars now for you to go and check out, depending on what topic you're interested in. And if you're at this webinar, you've probably here because you already get the newsletter. But if you found us on YouTube for some other reason, we do post these to the newsletter first. So my community always has first access to any of these webinar events. So if that is something of interest for you, then I encourage you to go sign up. All right, so if you're watching this while we're in premiere mode, you can use the YouTube chat box if you have a YouTube account. If you do not have a YouTube account, or if you're watching this and it's not during the premiere, please feel free to send me an email at consulting@rachelchristine.com. Please do note that my mom put an extra vowel in Rachel and took the H out of Christine. So it's RACHAEL Cristine. And we did get a couple of questions sent in ahead of time, so I'll move through these as part of the webinar, but of course, while we're doing this, please feel free to populate those questions in the chat box for us. And for these questions, I did edit for clarity and also to anonymize a little bit, just so that people who sent questions in can feel safe in having these be shared. So with that in mind, I am a career changer. I completed a master's degree in LIS, Library and Information Science / Archives, so that I can work on what I love. I found a dream job and I moved to another state to work there, only to be let go a year later due to reduction in workforce, COVID-related impacts. Now I'm struggling to find a permanent job in archives with a livable wage, as most jobs are temporary, offer low hourly pay, and the additional hurdle of requiring several years of experience in archives. Sadly, I find that administrative assistant positions that require a high school or associate's degree pays much more than a position as archivist, which requires a master's degree. And you are not wrong in that observation. I would be very interested in hearing your suggestion on how we can utilize other skills, prior experience, and our hard-earned higher education to find jobs at LAM institutions, but remain as close as possible to the field we have chosen, in my case, archives. So there are a lot of things going on in here, none of which is in your control per se for the person who sent this question. Prior to COVID, we knew that archives especially, but archives, libraries, and museums were struggling with extreme devaluation in the field. So we were seeing annual wages essentially go down. The numbers themselves stayed the same, but as you've hopefully picked up in the webinar, if the numbers are staying the same, then in fact you are being paid less because there's not that cost of living increase happening, which is why I was so frustrated to see that the majority of archivists are still paid $60,000 or less for the last 20 years. Anyway, so this is definitely an area where it was a problem before COVID, and COVID has made it worse. Yes, there is some of the benefits of some of the larger economics happening right now with the Great Resignation. There's been more turnover in workforce. Sometimes that can mean more opportunity of jobs opening. But that also means that many of these institutions, especially those who are not as economically resilient, don't have the wages that they should have, especially this year with the 9% inflation, to offer a good wage, let alone a living wage. So there's a lot of things at play here that aren't up to you as the person who asked the question. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is the state of the profession at the moment. And so sympathizing with you here. And you are also very correct. There are administrative assistant positions, project manager positions, positions that don't require a master's, which does not mean that they're not less skilled or less experienced, what have you, but can be very frustrating because you can see those types of positions and then be in a profession where you've got the master's degree, and yet there are positions for archivists being offered that are a livable wage and that should be an entry-level job, and yet are requiring tons of experience or picking candidates with tons of experience. So that is also not helping the situation for many of those LAM folks trying to find a job. There's not a good answer here. This is obviously a complex situation, many of which is like global economics at play right now. So the advice I would like to offer is to continue as you're searching for these jobs. Pay attention to where your skills can translate into. As you indicated in the second section of your question, there are many jobs at larger archives and museums that may not be collection direct or collection specific, but could be a good entry point into collections. So that could be one strategy. Another strategy could be getting a job that pays as much, if not more, while you continue to apply for other archives jobs or wait to apply for those jobs once they're more appropriately compensated. So that could be another strategy. Is there is no shame in taking a job that is paying you better for you to live your life. That is the market outwork, as well as that makes complete sense. You need to take care of yourself as a human first and to be paid what you're worth. So there are a couple different strategies you could go there. Otherwise, the strategies I have to offer are more advocacy for the entire field. For example, this has been part of my own frustration for the last decade and is why I have been pushing for paid internship programs and salary transparency. Those things unfortunately take time, but it can sometimes help us feel better knowing that we're at least part of the solution. So I know that's not a great silver bullet answer, so to speak, but just know that you are not alone, and know that there is no shame in taking a job that pays you better, even if it's not an archivist job right away. I would say don't sell yourself short and wait for a position that is actually going to compensate you appropriately. All right, I have the skill set to consult, but I'm finding it difficult to break out and find companies, museums, and other organizations to work with. Any advice? So we should definitely do a consulting webinar again. This is more in line with focusing on consulting, but because this question came in, I do want to do it the honor of answering it. There are many things you could do. I think it depends on what you're interested in and who your target audience is. For example, what sort of services are you offering? What location are you in? Are you willing to travel? That kind of thing. Directories seem to work really well in our field. So working with professional organizations to get listed in the various directories as a consultant. Also introduce yourself, especially to the organizations in your area, contributing to and joining different networks of colleagues is another great way. Many of the national organizations have like a independent consultants forum, where it can be great to connect with others or where opportunities are posted. So there are a few different ways you can tap into either being in the place people go to look for a consultant, or creating your own network of organizations who may not need you right now, but may need you in 2 to 5 years, or they may come across a colleague who needs you. So essentially building your network and in being in places where people will be looking. So that depends on what it is you're doing and where you are. But those are some of the first things to do if you want to be connected with people searching for consultants. The other thing I would recommend that's more of a long-term strategy is just contributing to your field. If you are contributing to your field, whether with service or thought leadership, offering resources, that's another great way to get your name out there and to show off your skill. That, of course, though, does depend on your capacity, because many of those things are service related, and that means you don't get compensated for them. So there's a balance there. But those are my first few types of strategies I would recommend you do. All right, and with that, that was the end of the prepared questions. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar, for all of the very sweet and thoughtful notes, for letting us know how valuable the first webinar has been. That's why we've done this follow-up one probably sooner than I would have if it were just up to me in a vacuum. So hopefully you found this helpful. Please feel free to email and follow up. And I wish you all the best of luck, because quite honestly, the better that we are all paid, like that's good for everybody. So knowing and having the skills to advocate for our value, it is helpful for you, but also selfishly, it's helpful for everybody else too. So selfishly for me, because it's helpful for me if you know your value and stand up in it. So that's all to say. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's hard. I know it can be disheartening, but it is also so incredibly important if our field is going to be healthy. And certainly if you're going to be healthy, being paid appropriately has so much to do with both our mental and physical health, sometimes quite literally. So please do what you can when you can in terms of standing in your value. And with that, I will let you go.